welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully everyone got the schedule for the rest of our Bicknell lectures. Dr. Frank Bicknell's family left us $25,000 in his honor back for his 80th birthday, and we've been sponsoring these lectures in his honor ever since. Tonight's topic is a brand new book, Boneyards, Detroit Underground, which is an exploration of burial sites and customs in Metro Detroit, the historical and social changes behind the treatment of the deceased in our area. The author and tonight's speaker is Richard Bak, who was born and raised in Detroit. Over the years, he's been a regular contributor to Our Detroit magazine, and for many years, the previous top Detroit magazine, Monthly Detroit, the Detroit Free Press, the Detroit News, and other publications. Before becoming a full-time writer, he served in the Marine Corps, drove a cab, and worked on an assembly line at Chrysler and Ford. Bak is a graduate of Eastern Michigan University, where he studied history and was editor of the school's literary magazine. His 27, he just mentioned Richard, not only these 20, there's 2 more books that he just finished today. Nonfiction books have been published in English, Chinese, and French, and his biography of Joe Louis was optioned by filmmaker Spike Lee. He's a recipient of over 50 journalism, literary, and broadcast awards, including the Forward Magazine Book of the Year Awards, 4 Midwest Book Awards, a pair of Michigan Emmys, and the Stuart and Bernice Grosse Award for Excellence in Literature. He currently lives in Dearborn with his wife of 34 years married, and as he mentioned, a one-eyed dog named Charlie. Richard Bak.
No, my wife has one eye, and the dog is 34.
That's right, the dog. Richard Bak, thank you.
Thank you. You know, I don't really need this mic.
Okay, good. We'll just slip it back up there. Wow. That was good for you.
Thanks, Mike. Good to see you sober this late in the day.
He knows me.
First time I've been here, actually I was at the Grosse Pointe Memorial many, many years ago. Amazing house, beautiful place, and I'm happy to be here. If I look a little out of it, like Mike mentioned, I just turned in 2 books in the last 72 hours. I'm too old to be pulling all-nighters, but I did 2 of them this week. And I got 3 hours sleep before I got here, and now I'm here. So we're going to do it off the cuff. People who know me also know that I have one leg firmly planted in the 19th century. So this stuff is PowerPoint. This is historic. It's the first time I ever used this. In fact, I think 4 trunks just opened in the parking lot when I did this. Everybody filled out a slip of paper? Because what I wanted to do, my mother always taught me, come bearing gifts. So I couldn't get those cheekies for 75 people, so what I did is a couple of books that I did a couple years ago, 2 years ago, Michigan and the Civil War, Distant Thunder. It actually has a lot of stuff in here about Decoration Day in the Detroit area, which kind of dovetails into this Boneyards book. And also Russell Alger's in there, so what the heck. So we'll draw a couple names and give these out at the end of the talk. And by the way, the sesquicentennial of the Civil War is coming up in April. It'll be 150 years. Seems like just is. Now, Boneyards. What the book is and what it isn't, and the genesis of it. The book is not a comprehensive history of cemeteries in the Metro Detroit area. Such a book would be impossible. It would be as impossible as trying to write a comprehensive history of Michigan in the Civil War. You could write 100 books about various aspects of Michigan in the Civil War, and you could write 100 books about all the cemeteries and all the various customs, funeral customs, and things like that in this area. In fact, in the 7-county area, there is approximately 800 cemeteries. And there may be more. I just could never get a real handle on how many there are, but that seemed to be pretty, an estimate that I was comfortable with. And so no, I did not visit all 800. I don't think I visited 10% of them. And frankly, after a while, one tombstone looks like another. But they are beautiful places, and hey, we're all going to wind up there sooner or later. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are, if they're not fascinated with the subject, they are at least intrigued by it. How many people would you say in this room, Mike, right now? 50, 60?
At least 40.
Okay.
See, I had counted. I should have counted.
Make me look good. Come on. 150, 3,000. Well, let's just say there are 100 people in this room. And there aren't, but let's just say that. make me feel better. Statistically speaking, if there were 100 people in this room, next year at this time there would only be 91 or 92 of you returning for another lecture. Michigan's mortality rate's about 8 to 8.5% per year. You look at Comerica Park on a sold-out afternoon, if you had, say, 44,000 people there, you come back the following year, 3,740 of them won't be there again. You know, life and death marches on. This book, the genesis was, I was working on a documentary on Tiger Stadium about 4 or 5 years ago, and when we completed it, we started shopping around for a new idea. We were thinking of doing something on Elmwood Cemetery. Well, even in flush times, it's hard to find financing for documentaries, so that idea fell apart. But a lot of the research I had done for the book, or for the movie documentary, found its way into this book. And my original thought was, well, I would go out there and do kind of a, comprehensive history of just cemeteries. And there are a few cemetery books like out there. They're always, they zero in on Woodmere or on Mount Olivet or Elmwood or Woodlawn. But then I realized that, of course, that would be impossible. As I mentioned, there's 800 of them just in this area. At about this time, my father passed away after a long bout with cancer. And it was, as anyone who's lost a parent, and there's a lot of people who have, it's a pretty devastating thing. And there's always a hole in your heart, even several years later. And it got me thinking a little bit. At the same time, I was turning 50. You start thinking about things that, you weren't thinking about when you were busier and younger. And so this book wound up becoming more of a meditation on death than anything. I started looking for telling anecdotes about, death and memorial in the Detroit area. And I was also fortunate to come across several very talented photographers, and Ted Fines is right with us, and he's one of the contributors to the book. And Ted donated several beautiful shots to the book, as did Paul Hitzelberger, and Greg Fader. In fact, that's Greg's photograph right there, and about 24 other photographers. So the pictures, in a lot of ways, drove where I was going. I didn't just want flat-on shots of a headstone, and here lies, Bill Smith, who was a lumberjack, and the tree fell on him in 1882. That wasn't what I was going for. I was going more for, I guess if there were two things that I wanted this book to illustrate or to convey, was number one, and this is I try to convey this through the random selection of the photographs that were in the book. How random death is, how utterly random death is. I first got a little taste of that just doing that Civil War book a few years ago. I can remember going through several letters and diaries of soldiers in the 24th Michigan and the 4th and so forth, who they were fascinated with what they had seen on the battlefield, whether they had survived. Well, obviously they survived, otherwise they wouldn't have written the letter. But how close they had come and how utterly arbitrary facing death was on the battlefield. Or actually in the medical ward, because half of the soldiers who died in the war, no, actually 70% of the soldiers who died in the war died of disease. I think it's 70%, somewhere around that. But at any rate, all this stuff was swirling around in my head, and that that was again the genesis of doing this book. The second point I was trying to get across, by the way this book was written, laid out, is how death is a great leveler. I mean, hey, you can have 3 yachts, 6 caddies, 53 Kaiser in a garage, all the money and stocks in the world. You're going to the same place that, some guy who's living in the back of his van in, Myers parking lot stuff. It's a great leveler. Now, let me go through some of these photographs, and I'll try to explain the origin of the photograph and what the pictures were saying. By the way, the beginning of the book, having said that this was a fairly loosey-goosey arrangement, and in the way I did the book, actually, there's an overarching narrative. There's a history of death in Detroit, you know, how we buried people 300 years ago, and you know, I give a rough idea of what the funeral business was like, home funerals to funeral homes and things like that. And then there's just a lot of subjects I touch on in the book that I can't touch on right here tonight. Including, by the way, pet cemeteries, which is one of my favorite, I love dogs. I got a 34-year-old Sharpei, did I tell you? Love dogs. Somebody asked me, well, you dedicated this book to the late great Barney. Now, who's that? Barney Shavinsky, or, you know, is it Uncle Barney? I said, no, Barney, my Sharpei, man. Poor thing died young of kidney disease. Still breaks me up. I'm just a little softy. Whoops.
Boy, Richard, when you get to 27 books, then you start honoring your dogs, huh?
I'm running out of people to honor. Okay, let's flip through this a little bit. This is Elmwood. Beautiful scene. I'm very favorite of this shot. Ted, you want to say anything about? You shot a lot of photographs over there. Want to contribute in?
No, you go ahead.
You can go help at all.
I will. If you want me to.
Alright, I just heard an alarm go off. This is Trinity Cemetery.
Yeah, I did that a few years ago.
Yeah, you weren't living then. Yeah, that's right.
I have not determined whether that's a child in that casket, or this is judging by the. This is over there on the southwest side of Detroit. Judging by the neck wear or lack of ties, I think this is a Lebanese funeral myself. I don't. Ted, what do you think?
I think it's Greek, and
Greek, okay.
and that's the Packard plant in the back, so it's
Oh, it's
actually
east side.
the east side.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, that's Packard at Utter Drive, or Grand Boulevard, and
Mount Elliott?
Mount Elliott. And in fact, there's a picture there that I took, and you'll see the same background. Accidentally. In fact, remember you and I talked about it.
Yeah, yeah. I'd say this is about 1915, maybe, judging by the
Yeah.
dress.
I think it's Greek.
No women are there, except for the one on the left,
Yeah, yeah,
living women.
yeah. Well, I don't know. What do you think? Is that a child, or is that it could be just a small
I think
woman?
it's an older woman, it's my guess.
This guy looks like the guy I played football with in high school.
Yeah,
I know that ain't Ray Muscat. He's 112 years old. I don't know. Where are the women? Oh, wait, right there.
there's one directly behind, yeah.
Yeah, the Bagoosh picture. Yeah, Bagoosh there.
There's one on the left.
I'll tell you, tie salesman could do good. Do good.
Actually, the women probably won't.
But you know what else this could be? At the period it looks like, if they're first generation immigrants, the men came first and the women came second.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Okay. Oh, Polonia. This was shot by, Ray, was it Project? Ralph Project. Ralph's a great photographer. Very moody shot. This is St. Hedwig's. This is where actually my family's buried. There in Dearborn Heights. My father's grave is 1.3 miles from my doorstep. That was another influencing factor doing this book. Is for 20 years I lived in the same house on the west side of Dearborn, and I have one cemetery, Mount Kelly, which is, I see it out of my backyard. In fact, there was a funeral on Saturday with bagpipes. It was beautiful. Just, you know. And then it got a little annoying when I was trying to watch the game, but yeah. But it was, you know, it was a beautiful cemetery. Been there for about 160 years. And then Northview Cemetery is only 4 streets down. That's where George Papard's buried. Maybe 18 fans probably. And then St. Hedwig's is 1 mile straight down York Street. And this is St. Hedwig's again, and actually that ceramic photograph should have been there. Apparently, some good citizen picked it up off the lawn and put it in the crook of that angel's arm. The thing about St. Hedwig's is that it has this very old section, and this is true with a lot of cemeteries. They have a very old section, you know, filled with East European graves and, you know, very beautiful statuary, monuments, and so forth. But over the last 30 or 40 years, when they've extended the grounds at various old cemeteries, you pretty much have to have a flat marker now, so they can mow easier around it, which I think is pretty facility myself. I may be wrong, and I'm sure there's people in this room who are, you know, genealogical buffs and cemetery historians and know much more than I do about the subject, but isn't it true that you can still have a statue like that above your grave today, but you'd have to pay extra for it? For the groundskeeping and so forth.
Not all cemeteries.
It's regulated by the cemetery.
It's regulated by the cemetery, but most cemeteries, in my experience, was like that. Okay. Here's my grave. The Indian mounds. Now, these burial mounds. It's interesting that, at least it was to me, that, the landscape of southeastern Michigan is so flat, and that's the way we think about it. But if you go to Elmwood Cemetery, which opened about 165 years ago or something like that, that actually, the landscape over there is pretty much what southeastern Michigan was like when the first Frenchmen came here. Very rolling, a lot of hills. We had sandy bluffs over there on Jefferson, along the waterfront, and streams that were filled in are now the sewer system, I guess, downtown Detroit. All those creeks that were downtown, Savoy Yard, a couple other ones. And the other, and a predominant feature of the landscape were these burial mounds. Throughout Michigan, there were probably about 1,000 of them. And this one was a great mound, I'll say. And it's over there, just south of Fort Wayne, when it was there. It was in Springwell's Township, which was swallowed up by Detroit sometime in 1910 or so. And this great mound was something like, I've heard varying estimates of its size, but it was maybe 2 or 3 football fields length long. So that would be what, 600 to 900 yards. No, I'm sorry. Feet. Don't ask me to convert to metric. And about 4 stories high, filled with all sorts of skeletal remains, some of them in a sitting position. Some of the bones that were found in there were of soldiers from the War of 1812. For all I know, local farmers could be tossed in there. I mean, you just don't know. These mounds, the interesting thing is, to me, the mounds really were not broken into for a long time. It was only by the mid to late 19th century that a lot of these mounds were leveled and broken into, and Indian souvenirs left and right being sold downtown. There was a giant mound in Warren, which gave Mound Road its name, from my understanding. And I think there's still a little mound in, and I haven't been in Fort Wayne in many years, in Fort Wayne, inside Fort Wayne. Does anybody know?
Yes, I manage Fort Wayne.
Jim Conway, yeah.
We have an Indian mound, and we have a record from the last excavation, which was 1945, that the archaeologist said there are still at least 2 burials in the mound.
Really? Okay. And how old do you think that mound is?
2 skeletons now in the possession of the University of Michigan Museum of Anthropology were radiocarbon dated about 900 to 1,000 years old.
Wow. This were some native Indian remains that were dug up in Oakland Township in the 1970s. I believe it was Potawatomi. Let me see. If you guys want to ask me about French aviation in the 20s, man, I can tell you
His
everything.
new book is on Charles Lindbergh and the competition to fly across the Atlantic.
Sorry about Charles.
So that's what's on your mind right now, right?
Yeah. It's horrible because writers' minds they're an inch deep and like a mile wide because you're jamming it with stuff all the time. But in any event, there is, of course, and Jim, you want to pitch in here? Help a guy out.
I know we had the Potawatomis on the site of Fort Wayne back in the 1700s, but I don't know anything about their customs.
Well, it's funny you asked, let me tell you. Okay, this is the fall of '77 anthropology professor. That is not her. This is the lady who State Commissioner on Indian Affairs got involved, and The bones were allowed to be studied scientifically by Oakland University, but they did have to return them to the descendants of the Potawatomi tribe that settled around Detroit about, long before the French and English got here. Very macabre. Very macabre. Okay, here's Detroit's first cemetery, right here. St. Anne's Church. And I believe this etching is from about 1750. You can tell the bluffs over there on the water. Almost, I would assume these were all Catholic burials. I mean, the entire, population of Detroit was French Catholic, obviously for the first 100 years or so. And, well, at least until the bridge got here. And the first known burial, let's see, was 1703 or 1705. But I assume there were burials almost immediately after Frenchmen arrived in 1701. Could have been a lady in childbirth, could have been a baby stillborn, could have been one of the soldiers or settlers who fell off a hill, I don't know. That cemetery was there. They brought it within the fort. After it started getting so crowded, they brought it within the fort and had a cemetery, churchyard grounds, which was common, of course, in the 19th century. Yeah, 1749. 1755, all the bodies were brought back within the fort, and those bodies were popping up on Jefferson for 150 years afterwards. The one thing I learned looking into the background of cemeteries and body removal and so forth in Detroit, they always did a bad job. In fact, there was an event at Eastern Market a couple of weeks ago, Wednesday. I wasn't able to attend, but I told people that, you're on basically what was the city cemetery in the mid-19th century. Russell Street Cemetery was where it was removed. About 4,800 bodies were dug up and removed from that area and placed in other cemeteries to make room for Eastern Market. And they did a poor job. I mean, the city, which is always screwed up. I mean, it was screwed up 200 years ago. There were no records. I mean, the records were destroyed. They didn't know who they were digging up. It was just, it was scandalous. And actually, I would have preferred to have spent more time on that in the book, but I was running out of time. I had to get it into the publisher. But it was a fascinating episode in Detroit history, the disinterment of almost 5,000 Detroiters, and it caused a lot of grief with families. The other thing that I found interesting about downtown Detroit, what we now know as downtown Detroit, the business district, is that really through the end of the 1800s, there were still little, just, like quarter-acre cemeteries, little family cemeteries that dated back to some of the original French families, perhaps, or somebody who had come a little bit later. What is now a parking lot, a small parking lot, could very well have been a family cemetery that, progress kind of moved around it, left this little island of maybe 4 or 5 or 10 graves. But as Detroit grew and grew through the 20th century, you would run across occasional news items where somebody was putting in a sewer line, somebody was excavating a basement or doing something and coming across, maybe a dozen bodies or skeletons or a skull or something like that. Downtown Detroit's streets underneath them are probably just filled with hundreds of bodies from 17 and 1800s. The last time somebody came across some bodies in downtown Detroit, the Freakton story on it, it's about 1982 or 84. I think it was on Cass, because at that time in the 1700s, early 1800s, Cass was outside the fort, and there was a military burial grounds there. And as development grew through that area, they were excavating bodies, but they didn't do a very good job of it, of course. So every once in a while, when somebody was digging something around Cass or someplace around there, they'd come across some bodies. This time they weren't able to identify the bodies, but they were to identify where they came. They were soldiers from the War of 1812. They could tell by the uniform remnants that they found with the bodies. This is one of the 800 cemeteries, and I say 800. It could be, it could be 875. It could be 792. I just don't know. But this is in Sharon Township. This was taken by Mark O'Brien, I believe. I love these old slabs, all weather beaten and so forth. The old grip and grin, the original grip and grin. J. Hunter died 1869. Hard to read. This is the first time I've seen these photographs this large. It's the first time I'm like looking at them for the first time. It's great. Oh yeah, here's the one haunted cemetery in the entire book. William Gnong Cemetery. William Gnong was a farmer. That's over there by what is that? John. Farmer out in Westland in the 19th century. And the oldest stones are his family members, of course. That cemetery, I believe, is only about an acre square, but it could be a little bit larger. The county, Wayne County owns it, which is the reason why it's falling apart. I gotta get in my digs. William, and by the way, the haunting that occurs here we go. Yes, Westland. William Gnong was a farmer, 1832, that dates back to. Apparently some woman who was buried there 100 years ago, her body washed up during a heavy rain. That happens. And now she's wandering she's wandering around Henry Ruff Road. So if you see some lady, looks to be about 150, 200 years old, wearing a nightie, not very flattering on that figure. Supposedly she runs across Henry Ruff Road and, causes accidents. Now, I drove there with the photographer, Kevin Knox, and we almost got in an accident because what we learned is that there's a sudden curve in front of the cemetery entrance. So I think that's the basis for all the accidents that are being reported. That's kind of a neat cemetery. I do remember getting stung by a wasp there, so it was a hot day when I was doing that. I love this shot. It's Mount Elliott. It's taken across the street, the monastery. February 26, 1922. I call this one Dead of Winter. Snapshot taken by a priest, I think a priest, but maybe not. 3 p.m. he even dates it.
Is that looking into Elmwood?
Busy day.
Beautiful shot. Right, Fader took this one of Elmwood. Love that statuary. Just beautiful. Now Elmwood, this is another thing I tried to do. I tried to get a handle on how many graves there are in the Metro Detroit area, and I gave up. I mean, when I was really industrious, I thought, well, gee, what I'll do is I'll go out there and contact each of the 800 cemeteries, for as many as I can, that are still active, and find out how many burials they have. Certainly they have records. Well, I got 3 different estimates for Elmwood, and that's from the people who work at Elmwood, and so I gave up. I was like, all right, they don't even know how many people are buried there. So, short of going around and counting every stone and monument, but I did come up with a rough estimate. I did roughly estimate the number of graves in several cemeteries, small and large, and I tried to, what is my best guess figure of how many graves are in the 7 county areas? Does anybody want to take a guess? Your guess may be as good as mine, but what do you think I came up with? Anybody?
It's gotta be a million.
Between 5 and 10 million. But, again, that's just based on, you know, extrapolating figures from maybe a dozen, and I just don't know. But you know what, I would say the low end sounds right to me, 4 or 5 million. And of course, yeah, remember, a lot of people that are buried here don't have any, you know, stones or anything, you just don't know where they're at. Life goes on. Sledding at Elmwood, 1885. It's my great aunt Zush.
Yeah, right.
In the middle of death is life. Love this. Well, the thing about cemeteries like Woodlawn and Elmwood, they were built during that garden cemetery movement in the 19th century, which was, you have to remember, most people were buried in graveyards prior to the building of large cemeteries in the 19th century. And those graveyard cemeteries were nasty. Everything I've ever read about them is just, you know, just disgusting because there were so many people buried in a small area. It's one thing when Detroit had 2,000 residents, but when you get up to, you know, 200,000 residents, you have to have a place to put the overflow. And so at any rate, the cemetery movement in the 19th century, which was to make death seem more appealing. The guy who's dead doesn't notice the difference, but the people who come to visit him certainly do. Instead of seeing cows munching on grass around your grandmother's tombstone, you go to a place like Woodmere or Woodlawn or Elmwood, and you can soak in the ambiance, the beauty, and it is. I mean, cemeteries are beautiful places. I mean, I'm not even a I'm not an account type person or anything, but they are beautiful places. At any rate, trolleys. They actually used to have trolley cars running out there on weekends, typically Sundays, but sometimes Saturdays. Trolley cars that went straight to the cemetery, and people would pack lunches. They'd go to the cemetery, often after Mass, dress the grave of a loved one, you know, put some flowers down, and, you know, have a ham sandwich. I mean, they did. They'd bring picnics. Seems a little offbeat, but, you know, there were no public parks back then. There was no public park system back then. This is one place where somebody in an urban area could actually go on a weekend and enjoy nature. As I mentioned, Elmwood, you go to Elmwood, you're stepping back in time 150, 200 years. Well, what do we have here? This is the new healthcare plan. This is what it gets. Grave robbers. This is what I write about in the book at some length. They were called resurrectionists. These were not resurrectionists. This actually is an autopsy or going on at we call it dissection or whatever, at Wayne Medical School in about 1898. This is the professor. These are his married men right here. Married women. This poor fella. We have no idea who he is. It was hard getting bodies for medical schools. Most people in the 19th century believed that you did not desecrate a body by letting medical schools perform, autopsies and so forth on it. So doctors had to learn their trade, and you had to get bodies. So this rather macabre trade became pretty lucrative. Grave robbing. Bodies might fetch $5 or $10, sometimes more, depending on want. But they would purchase bodies. Medical schools, through a third party, would purchase bodies, which were usually dug up at night, and transferred often out of state because you could avoid the local sheriff that way. One thing I found fascinating was that grave robbing was so prevalent for a while there that there are many graves today that have no bodies in it, and their descendants have no idea that they're praying or going to a in front of a tombstone that has no body underneath it. A really good grave robber, a really good resurrectionist, might be 2 or 3 of them working in tandem, would go into a graveyard at night, smash in the head, they would dig up the grave, smash in the coffin headboard, drag the body out, throw them in the back of a wagon, and off. And if they were good, they could do it in about 10 minutes flat. They would try to leave one person behind to smooth over the grave, tamp down the ground, make it look like it was undisturbed. And a lot of those graves, they never were noticed. Nobody ever noticed that. Hey, somebody dug it. Now, a lot of these graves, believe me, the guys went in there, it was rip and run. Pull the body out of the coffin, and just, it was a mess that they left behind. And there's all sorts of stories about grave robbers back then. It got so bad that families would actually get together and figure out, Tom, you spend Friday night guarding, parents, tombstone. Stan, you do it Saturday night. That's where the term graveyard shift came from. You would actually have to go in a graveyard at night during the height of this kind of craziness and, guard your loved ones' graves. At Highland Cemetery in Ypsilanti, they even had a booth that, the graveyard shift would use. Some guy be in there with a gun, rifle or whatever. And of course, a lot of those bodies were being used probably at the U of M medical schools over there. Spartans wouldn't do that. Of course they weren't around. I do go into great detail about, because this is a fascinating subject, I go into great detail about how things have changed, of course. Bodies are donated by families for to medical schools. And I know there's a ceremony at University of Michigan every year where a lot of these, the bodies have been used for medical science. There's a memorial service for these people. The bodies are treated respectfully. This is probably the most morbid shot in the book. And I did try to keep it respectful. I mean, I could have made it really, I came across some photographs that were really, really bad. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do this. But this was too good to let it. Apparently